This video is going to have a look at choosing the correct factorization method to be able to factorize an expression. So by the end of the video, you'll be able to choose the correct factorization method to be able to factorize an expression that is provided to you without needing to be told what method to be using. So in this topic, you have looked at a few different types of factorizing. You've looked at factorizing by removing the common factors. You've looked at factorizing the difference of two squares. You've looked at factorizing trinomials, where we've looked for the factor pairs of C and then looked for which factor pair added up to B. We've factorized by completing the square, and we've factorized by grouping. So you need to be able to tell by looking at an expression what type of factorization are you going to have to use to be able to factorize it. So let's have a look at how we can decide which factorization method to be using. And when we're factorizing, we've learned factorizing for three main types of expressions. And they are expressions that have two terms in them, expressions with three terms, and expressions with four terms. So that's going to be your first hint as to which method that you need to choose to be able to factorize an expression. Now, if it is an expression with two terms, you can either factorize it by removing the common factor. So for example, x squared plus 3x, you've got an x in both terms, so you can remove that as a common factor. If there isn't a common factor, then you can look at the difference of two squares. So it might be x squared minus 9. You don't have a common factor between x squared and 9, but you can factorize it using the difference of two squares. So they're the two methods that you would look at using if you had a two-term expression that you need to factorize. If you've got one with three terms, start off by looking at the factor pairs of C and seeing if any of those factor pairs add up to B. If you do come up with a factor pair combination that add up to B, then you will be able to factorize it using that method. So for example, x squared plus 3x plus 2, I've got a factor pair of 2 and 1, 2 plus 1 is 3, so I can use that method. If I can't use that method and I've got three terms, then the method you have to go to is completing the square. So for example, x squared plus 3x plus 1, my factor pairs of 1 is 1 and 1. I can't use my first method to be able to factorize those three terms. Then I have a look at being able to factorize it by completing the square. And then if I've got four terms, you look at factorizing it by grouping. So that's a bit of a flowchart as to how you can choose the correct method when you are factorizing. So let's have a look at a couple of examples and what method we would use to complete that factorization. So our first example is going to be x squared minus 25x. So the first thing I notice is that I've got two terms. So I'm looking at either removing a common factor or the difference of two squares. So looking at the terms, I've got x squared and I've got 25. I don't have a common factor between those two terms, so I can't remove the common factor. I need to look at the difference of two squares. Now remember, you can only use the difference of two squares if it is a subtraction. You cannot use it for an addition. So x squared minus 25, I would be using the difference of two squares, and it would be x plus 5x minus 5 as the factorized answer. So using my flowchart to be able to identify which one was the correct method. So having a look at a second example, x squared minus 7x plus 10. So starting off, I've got three terms. So I know I'm either looking at using a factor pair of C or completing the square. So having a look at my C value, it is 10. My B value is negative 7. I know that negative 5 times negative 2 is equal to 10. And negative 5 plus negative 2 is equal to negative 7. So I've got a factor pair of C that adds up to my B value. So I can factorize using that method. And my factorized answer would be x minus 5, x minus 2. So moving on, having a look at another example, x squared plus 9x. Here I've got two terms, so I'm either looking at removing a common factor or the difference of two squares. I've got a common factor of x between both my terms, so I can remove a common factor. So my factorized answer is going to be x and then x plus 9 in brackets. And looking at my last example, I've got x squared plus 5x minus 2. So I've got three terms. So I need to have a look to see whether I've got any factor pairs of negative 2. That's going to add up to 5. So my factor pairs of negative 2 are going to be 1 and negative 2, or negative 1 and 2. neither of those combinations are going to add up to 5. So I cannot factorize that expression by using a factor pair of C. So because I can't factorize it using that method, I need to complete the factorization by completing the square. So when you have an expression and you're looking to see what method of factorization that you want to be using, start off by looking at how many terms you've got, and then that will narrow down your options, and then have a look at the information in the expression to determine the best method. So it's really important that you're practicing being able to select the correct method and being able to factorize, because in an exam you will not be told to factorize this expression using the difference of two squares method. You will need to be able to identify which is the best method to be using.